The term sex. The thing about the term sex is that it has two uses. One of these uses it is too early in the morning to talk about. We'll actually have to talk about that use more next class, which has to do with having sex and your sexuality and various forms of erotic stuff. But it is more, at least in anthropology and other social sciences, it is actually used in this other sense, primarily in this other sense, or additionally, in the sense of the biological differences that we see in males, females, not just in humans, but in species that sexually reproduce. There's going to have to be biological differences to achieve sexual reproduction. And so the term sex refers to all those biological differences that we see. You were surprised. This word is so new. What's the new word? Gender, which is, we just mean it started coming into use, a new term in the 1970s. So 50 years ago is not new, but you would think this term seems so embedded in our lives that it seems like it should have been around earlier. But no, it was actually introduced in the 1970s. And basically, what people were trying to do when they introduced this term is to talk about that gender meant the social expectations that we have when we think a person has biological difference. So, for example, for those of you who have held babies, it's very different. It's very difficult to tell just from a baby's face or body what sex they are. And so they've done experiments where if you take a baby and dress him up in blue clothes and hand him to somebody and say, this is a boy, then they start bouncing it around and throwing it like a football and talking to it in this boy way. But if you take the same baby and you say, dress it up in pink and you hand it to a person and say, this is a girl, there'll be cooing and little bounces and no footballs. So it's the same biological sex, but we have different ideas about what, if we think someone is of a different biological sex, and we have different expectations for how we behave toward them, they behave toward us, what they are allowed to do, what we expect of them. So originally, these terms, so in the old days, like 100 years ago, the term sex was basically the same as gender. But now, or since the 1970s, we've tried to separate the idea of the social ideas that you can have about biological sex and the actual biological differences. Now, there are two ways that this creates issues, or you have to be careful, because we believe that our ideas about gender come to us from society. We have ideas about how different people should behave, but those are created by us. And so if you go to one society and they say, only women can weave, women have those delicate hands and they're the only ones who can weave these blankets. And then you go to a society 50 miles away and they say, only men can weave. Only men have the strength to do this. So you get these ideas about who can do what and who has which characteristics, and they come to us from society. But if I go out there in the world and I tell you that gender is socially constructed, your grandpa is going to look at me and be like, what do you mean? Men and women? What? They're different. Nobody's trying to say there are no biological differences. It just means that our ideas about those differences come to us from society. But this applies to many things. We'll later be talking about how race is also socially constructed. We may have talked about that a little tiny bit back in, maybe not enough when we're talking back about biological anthropology and human biological differences. Again, when we say that our ideas about race are socially constructed, that doesn't mean there's no biological differences between different people. It doesn't mean people don't come in different skin colors. They do. So just be careful of this. Gender is socially constructed, but that doesn't mean we're all the same. Crazy. The other thing is that in popular use, it's become, as your book says, it's interchangeable. So when somebody says gender out there in the world, outside of this classroom, you don't know if they mean sex or gender. So in the social sciences, we are trying to distinguish between those social expectations. But for most people, they don't like the word sex because it has that other connotation. So instead of the word sex, they're going to use the word gender when they might actually mean sex, they just don't want to say it. So it's a euphemism. It's like when you say, I'm going to the bathroom. There's not a bath in there. Anyway, sometimes there is, not in these. A euphemism, a way of saying something that you don't want to say. My best example, and actually the book's best example, are gender reveal parties. When somebody is exploding something and all this pink stuff comes out or blue stuff. You usually read about these when they burn down a forest because they've started. I don't know why, but they are often associated with crazy things that people do. If you're going to do one of these, try and make it like cutting into a cake or something like that. Try not to burn anything down. But a gender reveal party, has anybody been to one of these? What's it like? What are they doing? When does it happen? Before the baby's born. Now, this is very important to us because in the old days, back in the day, people were surprised. In fact, in the 1950s, people had to buy sometimes twin insurance because you might not know you had twins. That's how bad it was. You could have two kids come out and they'd be like, uh-oh, I need two cribs now. And so they bought what was called twin insurance. So if you only bought one crib and two babies came out, you were like, okay, all right, I don't have to buy two of everything. So, yes, you didn't know what it was going to be. But these days we have these ultrasounds and we can tell if they're twins, thank goodness. But we can also try to look for sex organs and development of specific sex organs. So when we have a gender reveal party, what these really should be called technically are sex reveal parties, because you're saying that I saw this sex reveal on an ultrasound. Of course, if you called it a sex reveal party, what's going to happen? Yeah, different kind of crowd shows. They're going to be given all kinds of presents. Yeah, that would be a different kind of party. So, anyway, the point of the matter is these terms just get all messed up in popular usage. You have to watch out for them. But we're going to try and use them in this way: gender, social stuff, sex, biological differences. Now, let's take a look at some of these biological differences, not like looking at them, but in chart form. This is on page 318 to 319 in word form, where they talk about chromosomes and gonads and genitalia and physical manifestations. There are all these social categories, and there are these biological differences that we really don't necessarily have social categories for. If you look at some of these things, there are people that are ambiguous in different ways. Now, I don't want to get my main point of this is that the way we used to think about biological sex, there's only two and you're one or the other, is actually more complicated than we once thought. Now, I'm not about to say that that means everybody is all mixed up. That's not the way things go. I'm just saying that there are things that happen that we didn't used to know about or we didn't really understand. And so I would say that for the most part, the majority of people probably fall into this category or this category, biologically speaking. And these are less common, but it's not like these are unnatural. Some of them are caused by what we might call our disorders, but there's nothing that people necessarily did. They just happen to be that way. People have differential development, things happen, and that isn't anyone's fault. And I will just say it's more complex than we were probably taught in our biology class. Both chromosomally, there's chromosomally and hormonally, different things can happen which cause variation in expression of sex characteristics. The other thing is that the way we expect people to behave and how we treat people and our children when we raise a boy or a girl, for example, actually can influence how they develop biologically. We talked about this a long time ago when we were talking about primate sexual dimorphism, is the differences in sex between males and females. But how might we treat people differently, which then results in people developing biologically different, like their bodies? Like, how might our social expectations of people translate into biological differences? So that's a great example. And you all have seen the NCAA weight rooms for boys and girls sports, where the men have an extended weight room. They give the women a few dumbbells. They're just not expected to do that. And there were, in many cases and in many places, basically either explicit prohibitions or implicit expectations that girls and young women shouldn't be participating in those activities, or it was seen as undesirable because if you were too muscular, then you wouldn't be attractive or have the wrong ideas. Now, hopefully those ideas are changing, but they were certain that is certain a way in which our social expectations influence our biological development. Another way, we talked about this before, is just simply what people are fed at the table. And in many families, say 100 years ago, it was assumed that, and probably true, that because the boys and the men needed to be out there doing the physical labor, that they were going to get they got the biggest piece of chicken. If you had chicken, that's what the men get. And the women get the sugars. And so you're going to biologically develop differently if your diet is different. Now, again, hopefully these things are changing. But what we know now is that sex, biological differences are more complicated than we thought, and that gender, our social expectations, also influence our sex development. And so we've come up with this whole new word with a little star in between, asterisk. What the hell is that? I underline the term academic because I've never seen this before. It was new to you, and it's new to me, and I don't know how I feel about it yet. It's an interesting term. It is an academic term, and if you type that into your document, it's going to give you a spell check error because we usually don't put little stars in the middle of words like that. What they're trying to do is to integrate the reality of social and physical as entangled and influencing one another in complex ways. So it's trying to get at this idea that you have biology and individual behavior and preferences all rolled into one gender sex ball. I like still talking about the social aspects and the biological aspects. I think they are intertwined. What I would say, my caution on this is that the term rolls them up together so tightly that I get nervous about it. But yeah, that's fun. All right, that's good. I'm not sure if this is going to stick, but this is an academic term. Academics sometimes make up words that don't go very far. This one might not. Gender has proliferated all over the place. Everybody uses it now. I'm not sure this is going to work. All right, so our next section is called binary gender and beyond. And there's a few things they are discussing here. The first thing that we should know is that even though people in our and other societies have started to realize that both sex and gender are more complicated than we might have thought before, globally, around the world, there's a lot of binary gender persistence. And in our own society, there's as well. And basically, our society still considers that there are two genders and that our social identities are shaped by those roles. And this comes up, as some of you noted, in terms of language use and how we talk how we talk to other people that we think are of a different gender, or how we expect people of different genders to speak. Now, you may remember from that film we watched about different languages, and for example, in Spanish and German and many of the European languages, all the nouns are also gendered. They come in basically male and female varieties. So some languages, it's difficult to be gender neutral in that everything has a gender and if you're using nouns. So Spanish is that way. And so people who are trying to adjust those languages to be less gendered, sort of a heavy lift, you might say. Interestingly, English is not very grammatically gendered. We don't talk about desks and tables and sun and moon as it's not grammatically gendered in our language. The really the only one of the only places that English is gendered is in terms of our pronoun use. So that has been gendered, but in terms of the rest of the grammar, English is not very gendered in its language use. There are languages, the text notes Mandarin Chinese, but there are others as well in which there aren't gendered pronouns. We're still working on our pronouns in English, but in some languages, this is not even an issue because you would not use gendered pronouns at all. They don't exist in that language. That said, you might not have gendered pronouns, but there might be other aspects of the language that might be gendered. It's not necessarily built into the grammar, but it can be built into other things, like the use of what is called vocal fry, creaky voice. What else? What else can influence? What else can happen in terms of gendered language? The pitch of our voice. So this is something that people use to judge or make assessments of other people. So basically, even though some people are trying to adjust some of these things around the world, there are still what they call cultural scripts for gender. So we've just talked about language, which is a big cultural script, how people dress, what you're supposed to be wearing, what you're allowed to wear, what is permitted to wear, how you move through the world, your posture. Let me give you this picture of a couple sitting on a bench in London or something. I think the guy is doing what has come to be called man spreading, where the knees are really wide and taking up a lot of space. Sometimes when you look around the room and you see people taking up space in different ways, and women in general are taught to constrain themselves and not to take up space, and men are taught to take up a lot of space. And these things are learned very early on. They're learned so early that we don't realize that we're doing this. We don't realize that the way we move through the world, the way we sit, the way we hold our bodies is actually influenced by the way we're brought up. And so going back to the babies that get bounced versus the babies who are cooed and put into very restrictive wear, or get their ears pierced and little jewelries put on them from the very beginning, it seems so natural to us that we just embody that. And the thing is if you deviate from those norms, it depends. What happens to people who deviate from the cultural scripts? Yeah. Seen as weird, teased. These things still happen, probably more than we know. In our own society, we have seen people try to break some of these binary rules, but a lot of people don't realize that this happens in other societies as well and has been around for a long time. So they give you the example of the fa'afine in Samoan society, and these individuals are males. They are biologically male, but they basically do women's work. So in some ways, they have their own gender category, you might say. They're not trying to be what we might call trans. or anything like that. They're males who are doing the work that is typically assigned to women. Another famous example are the Hijra in mostly in India, but also in Pakistan and Bangladesh. There's various ways. A lot of them are assigned male, but might go through some transgender operation. Again, it's a non-binary category. They don't mention this, but in many Native American societies, there are different words for this, but they'd have ideas of people who they call two spirits, who were born with both male and female characteristics and were in a special third or fourth gender category. A lot of these people were basically persecuted under colonialism, and so we don't know as much about what those might have been like. But some Native American societies are trying to recuperate those ideas. So we basically see that although we may think this is only going on in our own society, that actually, if you look around the world, there are all kinds of other ideas about social gender. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are doing body modification. Some are, some are not. But they might have people of one gender who are doing a different social role than another.